catch them up to speed. Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello. Yay, thank you for the wave. That was nice. I know we're all defrosting and waking up, and I know it's you trekked through very, very cold, snowy weather to be here. So I deeply appreciate you being here so early in the morning. Unfortunately, our traditional knowledge keeper that I had asked to join us this morning is working out of town and unable to join us. So please forgive me for having to be the focal point for our ceremonial opening today. But I still want to start us off in a good way. But please keep in mind my teachings aren't complete in the same way another knowledge keeper or elder would be. First off, I'll introduce myself. So, Gwe te Luisi Wetwillamit Wapewa. My English name is Mikaela Gabriel. The first spirit name that I received is Laughing Swan, and I just said hello. My name is Laughing Swan in Mi'kmaq. My mom is Italian, and my dad is Mi'kmaq Ukdaunguk, which is now known as Newfoundland. And like many Indigenous people, many Mi'kmaq people, he traveled far from his island repeatedly and always tried to return home in search of pretty much food and stability, which brought him to meet my mom, and that led to us all coming here. And I position that very concretely because this isn't my traditional territory. My traditional territory is across different waters. And I always like to keep that in mind, where eventually in the next couple minutes, when after some of the smudge is lit and after we go around and check in, I'd like you to just reflect on not only who you are, but what brought you here. And Canada is very commonly recognized as a very diverse nation, but it's really important to contextualize all the different ways that Canada has become home for a tremendous amount of diversity and many different orientations and speakers, which is so beautiful and powerful. But we can't forget how it started that way and a little bit of the history that holds us here. So in doing that and reminding ourselves of ourselves and how we got to this land, it's important that we understand who took care of it first, who took care of the good land and the good water to make sure we could move to a beautiful, fragrant, and wonderful space that has space to hold all of us. So that being said, I'm gonna be a little naughty. Oops. And part of traditional openings is commonly lighting a little bit of smudge. And people may have seen smudge sticks at like Urban Outfitters, but there's actually a tremendous amount of gravity, weight, knowledge, history that goes into this very simple, very sacred ceremony. I have here a braid of sweetgrass. It's curly like my hair, which is kind of fitting because sweetgrass is considered to be the hair of Mother Earth. It's one of the four sacred medicines, which I'll introduce you a little bit more to. So don't worry if these words are weird. I'll introduce you to a few of them in a few moments. But it's one such sections that we use for smudging. And I think sometimes when people hear about Indigenous spirituality or things, they'll automatically think it's religious and maybe they can't collaborate because of their own beliefs, and that's totally fine. But really, it's also a way of connecting us to the world around us. And it doesn't really have to have a religious connotation per se, but more of a recognition and a connection of we're human beings and we have what we call spirit, but like meaning and being and purpose in the world, much like every other being does. And it's also a way of grounding and cleansing ourselves. And again, a very simple but very powerful ceremony. So just that being said, I'm going to light some up. I promise it's going to smell a little bit, but it won't set off the fire alarms. It never has. You can see there's actually not too much smoke going. And I'm gonna, if you want, you can come up, but I'll teach you how to do it first. So in the smoke that rises, we pass our hands through the smoke. And it's just a way of washing. My teacher says that you can smudge anyway because everyone has a different way of washing their face in the morning, but it's a similar principle. The idea is that we cleanse ourselves with the smoke so that the rest of the day we're doing things in a good way. So I've just washed my hands through the smoke, so that means my hands are clean and I can bring them to the rest of myself. And we can set an intention, whatever intention you really like. But I like to think about when I pass the smoke over my head, I like to hope that the smoke cleanses and make sure I can think good thoughts and interpret and understand information clearly. When I bring it over my eyes, I hope that I'm able to see things as they really are, not as I necessarily hope or maybe, a heavy heart might perceive them to be. When I pass them over my ears, it's that I'm listening clearly to people, that I'm understanding what they're telling me and not what I hope that they're saying to me. When I pass to my mouth, I'm bringing it there to wash away any negativity and to say good words, to always bring good words to people. And then finally, I bring it to my heart, and I bring it to my heart 3 times, which is actually what a previous patient of mine, who's now unfortunately passed away, he taught me to bring the smudge to my heart 3 times, because hearts are very heavy and they're very powerful, so they need a little bit of extra medicine. So if anyone would like, you're more than welcome to come up and you can try a little bit of the smudge, but you don't have to, I promise. It's not scary. or I can bring some around. We also smudge spaces. And just as we're smudging ourselves, we're smudging our intentions for the day. Now, Dr. Smiley is many things, intelligent, brave, and a marathoner. So she'll start us off. Come on. I'm not scary, I promise. Okay. Okay. So just as I offer intentions for myself, I'm going to offer intentions for our day to day and for all of us here. Um, I think prayers can be done differently. And again, you might think this is a scientific space, Mikaela. Why are you talking about prayers? But think about it more as collective intention setting, if you will. So my intention and my hope for us all is that we all listen with good ears, we all defrost appropriately, and we're all able to sit comfortably as we take in different types of information. My hope is that we have a good conversation today, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour through history, but it's a necessary foundation to make sure we're all on the same page with different aspects of why these approaches, why these different distinctions, and why a lot of Indigenous history is so necessary. So because I don't know everything that you know about Indigenous history, experiences, and perceptions, especially when it comes to research, that means I'm going to have to catch us up a bit. It won't hopefully take too long, but I think it'll be important that we review at least a little bit, most especially how it pertains to Indigenous research, frameworks, analysis, and interpretation. So it all leads back home, I promise. That being said, I think it would be nice to go around the room and introduce ourselves. So what I'll ask you to do is just tell us your name, what your role is on this project, and a little bit about how you're doing today outside of being cold and just trying to warm up. We're all right in that boat together. So something a little bit more, if that's okay. And I'll start us off again, not too scary. So my name is Mikaela. So as I told you, I wear many different hats, but my role in this project is in Indigenous patient community engagement and making sure that any patient engagement is safe and grounded in our ways so that it's respectful and involved for both the community and for advancing science in a good way. And how am I doing? Um, you know what? I'm okay. And my heart is brightened by the memory of the fact that I bought a new rug for like my living area and my cats love it. They're like rolling around on it. And it was really cute because I thought they would start scratching it immediately, but they were like, it's super soft. So they're like rolling this way and rolling that and like hiding under the couch. Extremely cute. So that just like brightened my commute as I was defrosting today. I was like, those cutie little kitties. Anyway, can I pass it over to you to keep us going?
Be here. Very pleased to be here today. So how am I feeling? So I know we're not supposed to say we feel cold, but I feel very warm being here with all of you. And I'm grateful for Mikaela and our other speakers to come and kind of teach us a little bit more about Indigenous way of life and medicines and how that incorporates into our project. On a personal level, I just actually did some painting at my house, and everything looks nice and bright and new. So that's kind of made me feel nice this morning.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eileen. I'm a master's student in Dr. Anna Andreas's lab. I'm working as a trainee on the NFRF grant, working with beta testing a device for mitochondria isolation. How am I feeling? I like the mic in my hand. This is fun. And I'm looking forward to the weekend after the long week I've had. So feeling good.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel. I'm also a master's student in Anna's lab. I'm working currently to increase the lifespan of mitochondria post-isolation. And I am also feeling good because I am moving from my house that I've lived in my entire life. So I'm excited to start um, a new journey in a new place.
Hi everyone, I'm Madeline and I do the knowledge translation and communications for the project. I'm feeling good as well. I'm excited for the day and glad everything has gone relatively smoothly this morning. And lots of people have shown up and the coffee's here. So
Hello everyone. My name is Rowan. I'm an undergraduate researcher in Dr. Andreas's lab, working alongside Eileen on the isolation of mitochondria through the new Mito device. Um, as similar to Sonia, I am feeling much warmer than I was about half an hour ago. But I'm very excited to see how this day takes us, and what to learn today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Barangel. I'm the project manager for the NFRFT MitoRevolution project to basically get us all organized. At least I try. How I'm feeling today, honestly, this morning was kind of grumpy because of the slush that I have to walk through in my white shoes. But then I saw a Samoyed in pink booties, and now my day is much brighter. It's so cute. Yeah.
I want to follow that up. So my name is Aaron Klasky. I'm a staff scientist in the Acceleration Consortium, and I did my PhD with Frank Gu. So I'm working on automating the sort of formulation of isolated mitochondria and prolonging their sort of lifespan using different materials and biomaterials. And um, I guess overall, I'm feeling pretty good. I went to this new Persian restaurant that opened like down the street, Shamshiri, Young and Wellesley, really good. My Persian friend went and I went and we just like, balled out basically, and it was really good. So I'm feeling good about that.
Hello everyone, I'm Dida. I'm in the Radisic lab and he's not here, but I work with Dave on the more mitochondrial transplantation into tissues and ischemic tissues specifically. I was feeling a bit tired this morning, but I did watch a lot of cat videos, so I'm good now. And the coffee's here, so that's exciting. And I like to thank Mikaela about the session. I'm very excited. Thank you.
Hope it's good. No pressure.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry. My name is Raksha, and I'm a postdoc in Dr. Soumya Vishwanathan lab. I'm basically studying, trying to see how mitochondria is going to affect osteoarthritic patients. I'm at Toronto Western Hospital, Cranbell Institute. I have a 2-year-old. Every morning now she started like talking, it's like, I love you, like 10 times. So that makes my day like, every day. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate, and I'm a new PhD student with Chris Perry at York University. Our work will be hopefully focusing on a model of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I guess this morning I was feeling stressed, but when I got off the subway, I just loved how sunny it was and kind of the sparkle on the snow, as well as the really cool buildings here. So that was a highlight for my morning, and I'm excited for today. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arsalan. I'm a postdoc in Dr. Labuta's lab at Unity Health, and we are working on mitochondria delivery methods using microfluidic devices. And I made a mistake of trusting the streetcar schedules today, so that's why I'm late.
It's okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Caressa. I'm a master's student in the Frank Gu lab, and I'm working mostly on material sciences for helping preserve isolated mitochondrial viability, but also on looking at the natural decay kinetics as well as some automation. And I'm quite tired because my building had a fire alarm at 2 a.m. and I live on the top floor. So I'm quite tired, but I'm happy to not have to do science today because of that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sheldon. I am a PhD student with the Frank Gu lab. I mostly trying to use automation and hopefully some deep learning techniques to help find suitable formulations that help preserve and extend the viability of mitochondria post isolation. Today, I'm I feel happy that I get to be involved in like so many interesting and novel things. Just it's good to keep to keep busy and.
Tenzi Atoya. I'm Janet Smiley. I'm a family doctor, research scientist, Tier 1 CRC in advancing Indigenous health services, and a professor at the Dahlana School of Public Health and Department of Family and Community Medicine, Faculty of Medicine. And I'm okay. I'm tired. It's been a busy week. I had a colleague come up from the States yesterday, and we ran a workshop in partnership with the medical school to, we're developing and designing a trial for medical students to try to advance cultural safety and bias training. But I actually went to the Raptors game with my nephew last night. In my immediate family, my teenage sons don't like to go to the Raptors with me, but it's a little hobby. So I have to reach in my broader family circle. So that was really nice. We had a really nice time. He's a lovely young man. And I'm looking forward to it's going to be like a hard science day. I'm going to ask you questions I think that are harder than usual, because I actually think advancing science and advancing Indigenous science is really quite complex. So yeah, I'm excited to ask you a little bit about your epistemic locations, self-locations soon, and see if I can stretch your brains a little bit. That's me.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Lilian, and I'm a first-year master student from Dr. Ari Rasting's lab. And my work is about enhancing mitochondrial functions through pharmacological approaches to treat liver ischemia reperfusion injury. And one thing good about me is that I had a really good sleep yesterday, and and so yeah, so like everything today was like so good for me, and including the snow and the sunshine. And yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Andreasa. I'm one of the PIs that leads the MitoRevolution project across with some of the many of you that work with. I'm a professor in pharmacology and toxicology, and also the scientific director of MitoCHY. That is the Mitochondrial Innovation Initiative, a strategic initiative here at University of Toronto. Today, I feel really grateful, and I love what you said about roots. And the reason I feel so grateful today is because I had my sister and my nephew for 10 days with me here in Canada, and I haven't seen them since 2023. So it was such a wonderful thing to be together and feel the roots. Last night we were laughing so much. We started crying over so much we were laughing. So I feel really, really grateful this morning, and very grateful to hear how mitochondria has gone from one lab working in mitochondria to see all of you describing your projects. Also almost put tears in my eyes. So this is quite an incredible day. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kate Murray. I'm CEO and President of Mito Canada. If you haven't heard of us, we are the only foundation in Canada representing children and adults diagnosed with primary mitochondrial disease. Our role in this project is to work alongside our patient partners to bring their voice to the work that we're doing and include them in the work that we're doing. How do I feel? Well, the cold weather was certainly freshened me up this morning, but I'm absolutely loving the sunshine on my face and the coffee in my belly. So, but so pleased to be here today and to learn from all of you and from Mikaela as well, and how we move forward with intention and meaning in the work that we're doing.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. Oh, gosh. Oh, and can the people online both hear us and introduce themselves? I can't call on you by name because I can't see you, but I trust you to do so in an orderly fashion.
Hi, my name is Valentina Masleyeva, and I'm in the Ungreen Lab. I'm a PhD student, and my role is working on automation and optimization of mitochondrial isolation from platelets. So we are currently trying to establish the ethics protocols to be able to access platelets, like discard platelets from the clinic. And one good thing, well, it might not sound very good. I'm in Calgary, so it's kind of early here. But the good thing is that we have Chinook, and it's going to be +8 today.
Ooh. We are jealous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paulina Kwasala. I'm also from Ungern Lab. I'm working on optimizing of protocols of culturing and isolation too. Yeah, and my master's was about actually using secondary use tissues from animals borrowing from labs who've been accessing animals before me. Yeah, I'm also in Calgary. It's right now so nice because right now I see sunrise, but I feel a little bit embarrassed because you guys caught me right in the middle of my walk, and my lungs capacity is not good because I'm breathing heavily, and yeah. But otherwise, I'm grateful to be part of this giant project and be learning new different um, protocols, new different aspects, and like that. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Paulina. Please stay warm and safe. Oh my gosh, our tech person's so good. Thank you so much. So by the way, I keep slipping into saying thank you or miigwech. Miigwech means thank you, as you may have inferred, but it's in one of the languages of this territory, Anishinaabe-Moan. So just as an FYI. Now in our agenda, you'll see that as we're sliding into the beginnings, I wanted to preface this part one of introductions, but before I can actually do that, there's actually I was jumping too far ahead in our agenda. So while it says introductions to Indigenous medical exploitation, harm, experimentation, medical care, trust, and healthcare equality, a lot of that will be centered in part two. What I actually wanted to do is build an important foundation of why we're doing what we're doing, and some of the key, as Dr. Smiley mentioned, some of the key differences in terms of broad cultural perspectives for why Indigenous methods are so different. And unfortunately, this is where we're going to have to do a bit of a tour through the past in terms of understanding different approaches and what that's looked like through different aspects of harm. So first off, I'd like to situate us. As I gave my own introduction, I'd like to also introduce this beautiful land. So you've probably heard something similar like this as a land's acknowledgement, but I always like to think of it as like a warmer land invitation. We don't want it to be performative. That's why I'm going to ask you to think about your family and think about how your family got here. And if you actually don't know, maybe ask somebody, or if you can. But either way, we all find ourselves, unless you're in Calgary, but there's answers for that too. But where I'm standing right now is traditionally known as Toronto. It is a Mohawk word that means the place in the water where the trees are standing. Fun fact, now we know. Interestingly, there's a lot of Indigenous words that became the names for different places around Canada, which actually itself is an Indigenous word. So it's always really beautiful to see what those words mean and how it's been held over time. Toronto includes lands included in Treaty 13, as well as unceded, which means it was never given through treaties or through governments to the government of Canada. Unfortunately, that means it was taken. Territory of the traditional ancestral home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Mississauga, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation land. Now, those are what we recognize as the traditional caretakers, but we also know, even based on this room alone, that Toronto is now the home to many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples who come here in search of work, education, home and babies, advantageous, all the pursuits that we can really have with each other. So we recognize Toronto as not only being lovingly cared for by these people, but also that continues to be a home and a gathering place for many diverse Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups. And like I mentioned, since I don't have the official knowledge for Calgary, you can actually text this number. I can send this to you to find out more about the land you're on by texting the city and province you're in to 1-907-312-5085. I know that makes me sound like some kind of advertisement, but I think it's neat because like you're traveling somewhere and you're like, oh, okay, I'm in Canada, but you're like, it's actually all native land and there's a history to it and there's a name and there's a background. And isn't that neat? And with the power of the internet, you can just find out, because before it would a large part of this knowledge was inaccessible. So that's always a good time. So you can keep this practice going. I introduced myself briefly, very briefly, but as I mentioned, Actually, I don't even think I mentioned. So I'm a clinical and counseling psychologist. As I mentioned, I'm a Mi'kmaq girl. I do my clinical work at Native Women's Resource Center of Toronto. My focus of my research is in Indigenous women and two-spirit mental health and on homelessness, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in that area. I'm also a scientist at MAP Urban Center for Health Solutions, as well as Well Living House, and I also do some teaching. And you'll notice in all of those things, aside from the fact that my technical job title is a scientist, you'll notice I am not a biotechnician. I'm not a medical doctor. I don't think I would trust myself with a single mitochondria cell and try and keep it alive and well. So you all have a different skill set than I do. But, oh, we have someone that needs to be admitted into the room. But what I do have is the fundamentals and principles of not only Indigenous history, but the skill set to foster what does it mean to keep people safe. And that becomes an increasing theme throughout our journey today, is given the violations in healthcare and medical research history for Indigenous peoples, what does safety then actually look like, and how can that inform our practice? So I don't think I may have mentioned this before on the brief EDI event that we had earlier. Very commonly, I think people are like, okay, Indigenous peoples. Indigenous is a very broad term used to describe members of three very vast, diverse cultural groups in Canada. We have First Nations, both status and non-status, that's me. Métis, which is a very unique cultural grouping that have their own language, histories, and that would be Dr. Smiley, or a representative of Strong Métis Nation that I'll explore in her bio later. And the Inuit people are cousins from the north. Now, again, I note here that there's a three broad clumps for this giant landmass. So I'm doing a tremendous disservice of identifying the rich, beautiful cultural diversity, language groups, traditions, practices, regalia, peoples, all these things that have all developed and grown like with any rich culture across millennia of history. Current statistics, rough statistics, you're going to see me throughout this presentation and more point out about how many statistics can be wrong unless the science is done right. Over 50% of current stats can identify that 50% of the Indigenous population are under the age of 24. That's a very young population. And more than half are living in an urban environment. So when people tend to think of Indigenous peoples, a very common stereotype is that we're all on reserves. That's absolutely not true. Some people absolutely are. Some people have reserve communities, but more and more for the last several decades, we've seen what we call an urban push. So a forced, actual unfortunate movement due to a lack of sustainable or necessary experiences or opportunities within smaller communities to go to urban centers to either advance education, to access different jobs, and so on and so forth, or even increase healthcare. Again, like I mentioned, this is a growing population from 06 to 16. That number again increased for the general doubling of 42.5%, and we appreciate it as the fastest growing population in Canada. Okay, there's another question I like to ask after I offer these, but I'll look at it later. Why I bring up not only our population numbers and why it's a big statistic and why it's important to pay attention to is that Indigenous perceptions and conceptualizations of health are very different than broader Western aspects in Canada. And this is a bit of a cheat sheet to understanding later aspects that we'll consider when we think about what does health and research means and inform the research methodologies we actually employ. So very commonly in Western broad Canada society, appreciating there'll be changes from cultural groups. Western approaches are typically individualistic, like, you know, you want to be either the leader or as good as you can in your own field, and that's a worthy thing to strive for. But very commonly, Indigenous groups often focus on holistic or community focused. And we've actually seen this in the career research literature around when people are reflecting even what jobs they're looking at applying for. The first question isn't, what do I want to do most in the world? It's, what does my community need? And actually, I was in a meeting with Dr. Smiley and some other not mental health, but physical and primary health professionals from the North. And someone asked a really important question, and they said, I wonder what I would have done if colonization hadn't happened to my people. Like, what could I have pursued instead? And I know that answer. I would have been a writer. I would not have been a doctor. My Nona probably would have been disappointed, but I could have written stories. But now I'm here, and that's okay. It's we respond to the calls, but we have to pick up the call. Again, the idea, so this says connected to ancestors and spiral shape. That's actually our view of time, which is interesting. We tend to think of time as linear and linear chronology and A to B to C, but a lot of Indigenous teachings actually teach us that time is not so linear. It's actually 3 and 4D. There's a chronology to it. That is more spiral shaped as we understand that our ancestors, our connections, what happened before us actually has a place in the present. And interestingly, genomics and genetics are appreciating that aspects of epidemiology and epigenetics are reflected in how our ancestral DNA actually gets expressed due to our interactions with the environment. And part of that comes from what we call intergenerational trauma, but also experiences of how our ancestors' experiences, their interactions with the world shaped what was successful for their progeny to come down. So a lot of it actually does make sense when we invite science into the room as well. So it's always interesting how these ideas complement each other. There's typically, it says here there's the Cartesian split when we think about who we are in our bodies, and there's a graphic I promise to explore. And the Cartesian splits typically gives us the identity that, or the idea that there's our minds and our bodies. And that's usually it. We have mental health and we have physical health, and that makes sense, right? Okay, we see that we've seen the Bell Let's Talk videos. But actually for Indigenous peoples, very commonly, there's 4 dimensions of well-being. And again, there's a graph. It's not just mental health and physical health. There's also emotional health, so our hearts get involved, and spiritual health. And you saw me with that smudge earlier. That's a little nod to that. As opposed to focusing only on what's wrong, Indigenous metrics of health and well-being understand that when there's symptoms arising, it's because there's actually an imbalance across these areas, and health comes from balance across these 4 dimensions of our health and well-being, as opposed to walking in and asking a doctor, what's exactly wrong, what's bringing you in today. There's always the focus of what balance needs to be restored across these areas, and what domain is maybe functioning a little too much, and how do we balance that out for both physical and mental health. And I can give examples later. Very commonly in Western perceptions of health and well-being, there's a humans versus nature element that very prominently gets noted, that we're somehow higher than nature, or that we're better than nature in the natural world. And we see that unfortunately recognized throughout like tech industries and extraction and stuff. But honestly, I would never want to fight a bear. So I don't know where we got that idea from. I think opposable thumbs gave us way too much power. But anyway, but we appreciate from an Indigenous perspective that we're actually part of nature. We have obligations and rules to steward nature, but we're not above all things. We're sometimes maybe above an ant, but in some ways ants can teach us valuable lessons. We appreciate that we're in relation to the natural world around us. And I think there's a lot of powerful humility that we can gain when we think about animal and plants around us as things that we can learn from, as opposed to things that we can take. So this is what I mentioned. There's 4 quadrants. People may be familiar with this symbol. It's what's called the medicine wheel. There's different teachings around it, different perspectives, but at its most fundamental level, it reminds us that each aspect of our well-being to make us whole are composed of 4 different aspects of ourselves. So spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical, which is great. Now there's different, and again, this is a very, very simple circle with different quadrants, but there's actually so many rich teachings that I don't have time to share with you all today right now, but I can try and liken to them. But each dimension actually relates to different directions in our lives. So the cycle of what it means to be from a baby to our senior years, elements of the 4 directions themselves, so north, south, east, west. There's different animals, medicines, and teachings that go with every single one of these quadrants. And they're not actually quadrants. They're actually entire spheres. So they're just represented in a very simple circle. But when we think of them actually on a 3D level, we appreciate that the physical domain of our health and well-being is its own kind of world. It's its own kind of experience that can be filled up by navigating our physical health, going on gentle walks, getting exercise, breathing clean air, taking care of our health and well-being. But also our mental domain is also its own enriched mental domain. So we can do that by laughing with our friends, having a fun puzzle, something that intellectually stimulates us. The challenge is it can be very easy to only block out these 2, because I think to be successful in educational spheres and educational institutions, it's probably too expensive to try and navigate your mental and physical health and well-being and take care of your emotions. Very commonly, to be very successful, we have to kind of suppress our feelings. I don't know if anyone else had this, unless we unfortunately have like a breakdown and we're crying in Robarts. It really depends. But I think very commonly people are like, I don't have time to be stressed. I have to write this exam. Well, stress is going to happen. It's a matter of your mental, your well-being. You have to allow yourself to feel it. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of when we're in an institution and we're in a society that very quietly tucks it away, it's very easy to ignore. And then it becomes increasingly understanding why things like the prominence of understanding mental health and mental health approaches becomes even more important, because aspects are being neglected in favor of just one domain. So it's a bit of a wider view when it comes to these domains and what they really look like. But joke again, it's not just in these spheres. It actually takes place across time. So I mentioned there's that chronology across time. So the way our health and well-being is balanced is actually depending on where we are in history. And really challengingly, I think that makes sense when we turn on the news today. We understand that things like history, place in time, what's actually going on around us, culture, as well as the impacts of what came before us, all impact how we're doing. It might impact genetic disorders that are arising because of interactions with stress of our environment. When we think about nature versus nurture, that can also be an idea of what happens to us in our well-being when we think about these things. But also in aspects of what we call intergenerational gifts and intergenerational trauma. That's something that you may hear very commonly amongst Indigenous communities and participants. And it means that the aspects and behaviors and changes that have led to this current state of being. And by that, I mean the behaviors, the aspects of well-being and functioning that maybe our parents or our grandparents had to employ in order to survive their setting that impacted their parenting and then impacts our well-being when we grow up. So that's what we talk about when we talk about this lineage of how do we pay attention to the world around us and to the lineage of what came before us and what brings us here today. And this is what I mean by the Cartesian split. When we're only thinking that ourselves are made of the physical or mental, that means that we're already closing one entire eye to 50% of what it means to be a person. From an Indigenous point of view, everyone has their own. And I bring this up so prominently because I'm going to ask you to pay attention to this, because this becomes very important when we think about Indigenous health metrics. We have to think about what does health mean? And if we're only asking 50% of the right questions, we're ignoring and missing an entire tremendous amount of what health means to that person. For example, if you're only approaching a simple Western checklist that doesn't include emotional or spiritual or cultural domains to well-being, then you might not actually capture any of that person's strengths, because they might have a physical health disorder and that might be causing a lot of distress, but maybe their emotional and health and well-being is actually quite high and quite supported because they have good culture and community around them. And that might be something that's really instrumental to their well-being, to getting by and focusing and things like pain management every day. There's a lot of elements that become very crucial to understand when we appreciate there's differences to how we think, how we navigate the world, and how we can ask questions about what does health mean and how does health look for that person. I have an elder that put it in probably a more succinct way than I have. So he said, you talk about mental health or physical health or emotional health. The outside world takes them apart. It dissects everything. We have psychologists, physical doctors are already here, and psychiatrists. And it's not about zeroing in on any one of those. It's about the whole being, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. To be brought up in a well society, a well family, brought up in a well environment creates a well person. The ability to teach our children how to think, not what to think. That's one of the greatest impositions in our society. Like I mentioned, Indigenous people are a young population. Half are under the age of 25, 4 times the growth rate. This is pretty much almost the same slide, but it has that key question. With many people living and moving off reserve, just doing a quick time check, we also appreciate that if Indigenous people are the future in Canada, what do we want that future to look like? The challenge is that when we start asking about Indigenous realities, we have to appreciate that not only is history quite different, but our relationship to institutions becomes quite different. Typically, when I talk about institutions and care systems, when we think about our reality, when we're like, okay, I'm sick, I'm going to go to the hospital. If I'm in trouble, I can call the cops and maybe they can help, or I can go to school to learn things. Those are understandable, very common metrics of reality that many people live with. But for Indigenous peoples, that's not the case. Broader Canadian society is beginning to wake up to the reality of Indigenous peoples. But unfortunately, it's effortful, systemic, and meaningful action is really the most crucial part for effective change. So when we think about, again, if I'm sick, I can go to the doctor and they'll help me. But what actually happens if that same pathway has caused harm and even genocide? That's a big question, right? So unfortunately, we're going to have to take a tour through history to understand why that means. And I promise you're going to be like, Mikaela, this is a wide range to get back to like mitochondria. I know, but it's important. So follow me here. There's a reason why it's all trees on these pictures. So people have also heard of the Indian Act. I can't do it total justice, but what I can tell you is that the Indian Act during the formation of what's now known as Canada was introduced, in which what was supposed to be a nation-to-nation sovereign connection between Indigenous peoples and the government of and the nation of Canada at the time, the Crown, was supposed to be a protective, supportive trade. Actually became an increasingly paternalistic efforts of control and what later became we'll leave it at control. Parts of the Indian Act determined movement, as in movement. Number one, saw the creation of reserves, but also forbade Indigenous people to leave reserves if there were reserves in their area without representation and without signed authority. This is where a lot of regalia, culture, ceremony was made illegal until I believe it was the 60s. So actually, any of the earrings that you will commonly see me wear wasn't legal to wear for a very long time. Medicine bags, traditions, the smudge I just did was actually a punishable offense. It prohibited a tremendous amount of forming our own organizations and implemented different changes with regard to what we could do, how we could do, the names we had for ourselves, what education meant, and a tremendous amount of disproportionate impacts that we continue to see today. I know that's a very, very brief view of things. The challenge is this only looks at First Nations history. The Indian Act and the effective status card actually disproportionately impacts Métis people who were then caught within these two worlds of Europeans and First Nations, and were this unique cultural group, as well as Inuit people who also were left out of the Indian Act. Unfortunately, this meant that there's huge patchworks with regard to efforts of control, but also tremendous harm that was considered legal at the time. Okay, this is also another important part, is that the Indian Act made Indigenous peoples legal wards of the state so that they were under control of the government. So when we consider things like residential schools, which I know is becoming increasingly common in the media to talk about, they were allowed legally to go into places and take children to then go to residential schools. It was within their legal right, and their parents were able to be legally punished for trying to keep their children at home. These are some photos of individuals that went to residential schools and shows how they were seen as quote unquote successful because their culture was stripped from them. Indigenous peoples of both Canada and across the world have been subjected to genocide and attempts to deliberately destroy cultures, all to gain access to land. So that land acknowledgement becomes very important because land is a powerful resource. By removing and targeting the children, they attempted to interrupt the transmission of those practices and then dismantle family units so it wouldn't be a problem. You don't need access or traditional territories if there's none left. This is a brief view of the amount of residential schools across Canada. It's actually not perfectly complete. It doesn't include the United States, and it also doesn't include Newfoundland and Labrador, but they were there as well. Children were often shuttled. And I bring this up because I think it's important to focus on the fact that it's across Canada. It's a systemic, across like nationwide implemented factor that tried to enforce these methods and approaches. And again, there's an entire full day I could talk about the treatment received at residential schools, the harm that was created there, how it impacted families, and how it impacts the mental health and well-being of Indigenous peoples today, not only First Nations, but Métis and Inuit peoples as well. But I think what's important to note is that it's not just one person's experience. It's a systemic enforcement across really all of what we call Turtle Island, but both the US and Canada, with regard to the enforcement of these beliefs and the approach eradication of culture and perspectives in health and well-being. And once again, that's a kind of the summary of the institution of when we think about education, when we think about we go to schools to learn. From an Indigenous perspective, traditionally, that's actually not where we go to learn. That's where we go to experience harm. Similarly, with police officers, there's been a lot more reports of what's called the Starlight Tours, and this is unfortunately one example of harmful interactions between police services and Indigenous peoples. Colloquially known as Starlight Tours. In summary, a Starlight Tour happens when an Indigenous person, frequently Indigenous men, is picked up by the police at night and abandoned outside the city limits in sub-zero temperatures. And egregious abuse of power tours were carried out in winter and the men were left to freeze. This practice came to public eye after one man, Daryl Knight, survived an attempted tour and filed a complaint against the officers. It was only after he came forward that the deaths of Neil Stonechild, Rodney Nastis, and Lawrence Wagner were deemed suspicious because of existing prejudice and racism within the police force. It was assumed that these men had quote unquote gotten drunk and wandered off into the night. And it continues from there. So once again, that's just one brief example of police harms against Indigenous peoples. But when we think about who do we call if something's going wrong, if this is living in our memory and our history in our communities, that 911 call is not going to feel so effortful towards safety, right? And again, hospital systems, and this is where it becomes challenging. I told you I'm taking you on a tour, and it's not a great tour, but it's an important one. Indian hospitals are racially segregated, isolated hospitals where unconsented medical procedures and experiments and unnecessary procedures were often conducted. Unfortunately, in Canada, segregation, we're not exactly unfamiliar with it. But Indian hospitals weren't something that was really well appreciated and was seen as an ongoing evolution after and throughout residential schools. This patient described his time in Indian hospitals as they removed 3 ribs and they removed part of my lung. Now I've got these stumps in my back on my left side and no ribs there. They used a saw. I was awake and I could hear the saw. They got partway through and then they told me, now we're breaking the ribs off. When they did that, it felt like someone hit you inside your chest. And they did that 3 times. I just heard the saw buzzing away and cutting stuff. Now these are experimental, unconsented procedures. And you might think this was a really long time ago, but when I was interviewing elders for a recent project, they talked about when they're deciding to go to school, or to not to school, but to hospitals. They were like, okay, but you can't go to the hospital because you're either not going to come back or they're going to ship you to an Indian hospital. So I know these are horrific atrocities to talk about, especially so early on a very frigid morning. But this is why when I'm talking about strengthening our foundations, the reasons why we need to have powerful foundations of ethics is that we understand what the past has looked like. And we know that we not only can't do this again, but we have to have exceptional ethics and care for every dimensions of our health and well-being, because these are the realities of the First Nations people of Canada, of the First Peoples of Canada, not just the First Nations people, for all of us in Canada that called this place home before we welcomed everyone. I may have gotten carried away. So this is an unfortunate one. This was actually, and we'll see more of this when it comes to research, but unfortunately, what we now know is the Canada Food Guide was actually informed from starvation experiments in the residential school system. So the way that they were determined how much of certain vitamins that were actually needed was through deprivation experiments run by a nutritionist, I believe, or a physician called Dr. Pett, who later contributed these recommendations to Canada's Food Guide. So from this article, and I have it all cited if you like, they took the extremely racist idea that Indigenous peoples were somehow racially inferior, and they suggested that might have to do with nutrition. So they took it upon themselves to solve this quote unquote Indian problem through expert interventions into Indigenous peoples' diets. Another quote here says, they used the opportunity of hungry kids in residential schools who had no choice in what they were going to eat and whose parents had no choice in what they were going to eat to attempt to answer a series of questions that were of interest to him professionally and scientifically. So you can draw a direct line between the types of experiments that were being done in residential schools and these larger debates about how they should structure the food guide. So unfortunately, I should have probably prefaced this. When we learn more about Indigenous history, we're going to begin to see Canada very differently. And I'm going to ask you to not look away. It's as pretty dark as dark can be, but I promise I'll bring you to an important place afterwards. But we, again, have to understand that. Again, these same systems of education, healthcare, and law enforcement that the broad Canadian population rely on for safety, stability, and support have all been intentional methods of genocide, cultural erasure, and harm. And we continue to see this. Again, this describes how children were abducted from their homes to be taken to residential schools. When their parents protested, they were often taken to jail. This is from 2020, but unfortunately, we've seen more recent experiences, unfortunately, of Indigenous patients accessing emergency healthcare services and being what's called ignored to death. Joyce Echaquan's death highlighted systemic racism in healthcare, according to experts, leading to an apology from the Canadian Medical Association. And 11 days and 6 Indigenous people have died after coming in contact with police across Canada. That was just from 2024. So I understand a lot of this seems like Indigenous history, but it's powerfully pervasive because a lot of people don't have the same education that we're talking about today. challengingly, again, when one door closes, I know a lot of people think residential schools seem very far away, but actually it just continued to take different shapes to adapt to persistence in the present. There's things called the 60s and Millennium Scoops, in which there were birth alerts in hospitals as well as in adoption centers where Indigenous children were removed from their families when being born in hospitals and adopted out into non-Indigenous families, forced sterilization of Indigenous girls and women, even as young as 10. People often see the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls really splattered quite across the news and don't really understand exactly all that goes into that, but appreciating that it's the rates of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited peoples is 10 times being missing or murdered is 10 times higher than all other ethnicities. My cousin actually passed away from murder, which was only caught 30 years later in 1979. So we think that these things are very far away, but they're actually much closer than we think. And once again, birth alerts for child extraction. They say it was only stopped in 2019, but future research from both Dr. Smiley and myself will see how these things haven't really stopped. They've only changed shape when it comes to dismantling Indigenous family units. Now I appreciate we're also going a little bit over time, so I'm gonna wiggle through the next parts. And I remember that map I showed you across all those residential schools across Canada. I think it makes sense, and it's important that it makes sense that we have this kind of zoomed out quality of appreciating the entire nations and the impacts of colonization on the nation, because it makes more sense when we look at the statistics of what's happening in Indigenous communities. Very commonly, it's reported that tremendously high rates of housing on reserves is substandard, more major structural damage and overcrowding and resulting in health issues. And that's part of that urban push I talked to you about. There's also a tremendous impact of water quality on First Nations reserves and in communities that have high risk of contamination. So for those of you that may be interested in toxicology, you'll see that in some of the readings I sent you. Again, there's high rates of unemployment across small communities and reserves due to ongoing barriers, overt racism, and lack of educational supports. And again, that urban movement that I mentioned, that's been very prominent since the 1950s. And including my own dad, he had to leave home. He didn't want to leave his island. He's like, it's beautiful. There's mountains. I don't want to leave home. But he had to because there wasn't more jobs either near his family or near his community, or at least in other places. They didn't know who he was or what his background was. For a host of other reasons, there's a tremendous overrepresentation of our people in prison systems. So women are 50% of all federally incarcerated people and 28% of all federally incarcerated people. So again, why I bring this up is very commonly when people think about these Indigenous narratives and perspectives, especially when it comes to homelessness, which is my field of research, they're like, well, that person didn't try hard enough. But actually, when we think about you're being born, again, when we think about how we're born into this space and time, if you're born into a system actively working to harm in one way or to destabilize your family unit, then these numbers make a lot more sense. It's not just one person's lack of effort, it's systemic issues across the board, which means we need to have systemic approaches and responses, effortful responses. But it also, like I'm saying in this slide, we can also notice that it's not just one place, one town, it's across all of Canada. And that's why we often commonly see high rates of visibly homeless, disproportionately homeless Indigenous peoples across urban centers. So we face an uphill battle. And that's why I talk about until we address systemic and structural racism with knowledge, with understanding, with tools, with teachings, then there's really no guarantee for safety. And when we're not safe somewhere, we're going to leave. And that's why very commonly, facing historic and persistent racism, harm, extraction, and barriers, many Indigenous peoples go to Indigenous sources, community services and supports for not only support and understanding and a lack of racism, but care that actually reflects and understands those 4 quadrants of health, that knows what it means to ask about our emotional and spiritual health, our community connection and care. Without Indigenous representation, cultural safety training, and understandings of staff approaches and knowledges, we're more likely to drop out of just Western care programs. We'll very likely stop seeking care or only seek care in dire circumstances. And my question for that is, well, wouldn't you? Based on everything I told you, who would want to unless you have to? And then if you're showing up to those systems, that isn't always seen as what it should be, which is a tremendous amount of bravery.